Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and to the new viewers. This is the Scharnhorst channel. I'm Scharnhorst, your host, and today going to react to a documentary about the World War II German battleship or battle cruiser called the Scharnhorst. The documentary's name is The Life and Death of the Scharnhorst. Now, before we start, I would encourage you to like and subscribe to my channel, my social media. To get access to my full uncut content, please visit my Patreon, also in the links below. And let's get to the video. Enjoy.
Well, our BBC One's afternoon continues with the life and death of the Scharnhorst in War at Sea. This programme was first shown on St. Stephen's Day 1971, the 28th anniversary of the sinking of the Scharnhorst.
Yeah.
She was Germany's most successful battleship.
It's most successful.
She sank an aircraft carrier, an armed merchant cruiser, 2 destroyers and 100,000 tons of merchant shipping. For over 4 years, she survived the hazards of bomb, shell, torpedo, and mine. Her name was Scharnhorst.
I always thought the Bismarck was the most successful.
Just 28 years ago tonight, on St. Stephen's Day 1943, the German battleship Scharnhorst, or battle cruiser as we used to call her, was sunk in the Arctic by the guns and torpedoes of the British Home Fleet. The German Navy called her the Lucky Scharnhorst, and she had been lucky until then. She was also what sailors call a happy ship, and all those who served in her were intensely proud of her. Now, unlike the German battleships of the First World War, which had to restrict their operations to the area of the North Sea, those in the Second War were able to go much further afield. Their range was greater, and they burnt oil instead of coal, and so could refuel from tankers which had been sent ahead. The area of Scharnhorst's operations stretched from the Baltic right up the coast of Norway to the Arctic, down to Iceland, across the Atlantic, 2/3 of the way to America, down south of the Azores, and then back from the northwest of France through the English Channel to Wilhelmshaven, her home base in Germany. For tonight we shall be following Scharnhorst's career in those waters with the help of participants on both sides, British and German, and also original film, much of which was shot by camera crews who were in the Scharnhorst at the time. We shall be using these models here to represent some of the British and German ships. This then is Scharnhorst's story, her life and death, and to begin with, her birth. She was launched at Wilhelmshaven in 1936 and named after the famous general of the Napoleonic Wars.
Wow.
She was the first battleship of Germany's new resurgent navy. Bismarck, Tirpitz, and others even vaster were to follow. She was a graceful ship with long, slender lines and distinctive flared bow. 32,000 tons, she had a wartime complement of nearly 2,000 officers and men, among them midshipmen, paymasters, meteorological experts, cipher clerks, a camera crew, and a padre. Her 11-inch guns were inferior to those of any British battleship, but her speed of 32 knots made her virtually uncatchable.
Yes. It's a beautiful ship.
Scharnhorst was put into commission. I was the first navigating officer. On that day, we had a dinner in the officers' wardroom, and the captain has given a speech to the officers and said, "Gentlemen, remember that the spirit you will put into the crew of a ship will stay as long as the ship is alive." And that was happened. Scharnhorst was a lucky ship.
Hitler had told his admirals there would be no war until at least 1944, by which time the German Navy would be in a position to challenge the British. But this promise went the way of most of his others. And when war did break out in September 1939, Scharnhorst and her sister ship Gneisenau were still not fully operational. That same month, a new captain was appointed to her, Kurt Cæsar Hoffmann, who was to command her brilliantly during the next 2.5 years. By November, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were ready for their first sortie and sailed north towards the Atlantic. On November the 23rd, at about 4 in the afternoon, they were here, between the Faroes and Iceland, when the Scharnhorst sighted a ship. She was the old P&O liner Rawalpindi, which in peacetime had carried thousands of soldiers and civil servants and their wives and families to and from India. Now she was in the Royal Navy, armed with ancient 6-inch guns, a part of the Northern Patrol whose main job was to intercept enemy merchant ships trying to get back to Germany. She was commanded by my father, who'd been retired from the Navy because of government economies after the First World War, a thing that greatly saddened him. And now, 18 years later, and at the age of 60, he found himself, to his inexpressible joy, recalled to sea. A few weeks earlier, he'd written to my mother, wondering if he hadn't got, as he put it, too rusty. And he went on, "It's all come back, and I find that there is little I've forgotten. But I feel I must make good, and I realize the responsibility of this command more than any former ones." His crew, many of whom had served the ship in peacetime, were mostly naval pensioners and reservists. Well, Scharnhorst signaled Rawalpindi to stop and fired a warning shot across her bows, both of which she ignored. Then Scharnhorst opened fire with her main guns, and immediately Rawalpindi replied with her 4 starboard guns. It was, of course, a hopelessly unequal match, and soon Rawalpindi was on fire fore and aft. She did, however, score 1 hit on Scharnhorst's forecastle. Abandoned ship was now ordered, and some of the survivors succeeded in lowering 3 boats. As they dropped astern, they watched the Rawalpindi, still forging ahead, disappear like a blazing bonfire into the dusk. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau picked up 27 men, and next day a British ship rescued another 11. Unfortunately, my father was not among them. Well, in Britain, this action somehow caught the country's imagination in a way that it might not have done later. For it was the first naval action of the war, and it showed people that they could still rely on the Navy, and that even in a ship manned by pensioners and reservists, the Navy was going to fight this war's battles as it had those of the past, whatever the outcome, whatever the odds. As the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain, said of the Rawalpindi's crew, they must have known as soon as they sighted the enemy that there was no chance for them, but they had no thought of surrender. Their example will be an inspiration to those who come after them. Well, the Admiralty now sent every available ship after the German squadron. But the German admiral cunningly took his ships up here, hung about for 2 days in the Arctic, then, in tempestuous weather, raced home down the Norwegian coast. 4 days after sinking the Rawalpindi, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were safely back at anchor in Wilhelmshaven.
Yo, look at that formation.
In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway, and 2 months later, the British had to evacuate. One of the last ships to leave Norway was the old aircraft carrier Glorious, escorted by the destroyers Acasta and Ardent. On the afternoon of June the 8th, Glorious was west of the Lofoten Islands on her way back to Britain. She had on board Swordfish aircraft, but unaccountably, and in the event unforgivably, none of them had been ordered on patrol. Perhaps her captain felt that in such a remote sea area, his ship was safe from attack.
A midshipman in the foretop suddenly has seen a very short cloud of smoke in a big distance. He reported, Scharnhorst steamed to this cloud, and shortly later was recovered as an aircraft carrier, which we attacked, and the first impression was that we must hit as soon as possible on the flight deck.
There was a fearful swishing noise. It went right over the flight deck. I thought, this is it. And before long, another salvo came in and set the whole hangar ablaze, the aircraft, everything.
Sure.
With Glorious sinking, Scharnhorst turned her attention to the 2 destroyers. Neither stood a chance. Ardent was soon sunk, and then Acasta made a last desperate stand.
After our chummy ship, the Ardent, had been sunk. It was then our turn. Just before we came out of the smoke screen, we had orders we was going to fire 4 torpedoes. We came out of the smoke screen and altered course to starboard and fired the 4 torpedoes, and all of a sudden there was a great cheer went up, and I looked over and I could see a great column of water rise from one of the sides of the ship.
Later on we learned that 2 petty officers and 46 men have been killed. We got this also a lot of water into the ship, had to break off the operation and steam on 1 engine to one time.
The captain gave the order abandon ship, and approximately 100 men abandoned ship. After about 4 days in the water, there was only 3 of us left. One of those died half an hour before we was picked up by a trawler, and the other chap died in hospital, leaving me the only survivor from 150 men.
Sure.
From Glorious's ship's company of 1,203, only 43 were saved, and from the Ardent, only 2, both picked up by a German seaplane. And yet, when one remembers the number of troop ships and tankers that were returning from Norway at this time, many of them very close to the track of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, one realizes how lucky they were not to have been annihilated too. Well, that same summer, the German army overran France, and this gave the German Navy a sudden and unexpected windfall, a number of well-equipped ports on the very edge of the Atlantic battlefield, the place where the real sea war was being fought out. Brest, in particular, had docks that could take both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. On January the 22nd, 1941, the battle cruisers sailed north to the Atlantic under Admiral Gunther Lütjens, later to die in the Bismarck. And on the night of February the 3rd, they passed through the Denmark Straits between Iceland and Greenland unobserved and reached the open Atlantic. Next morning, the Admiral signaled to his squadron, "For the first time in our history, German surface warships have succeeded in breaking through the British blockade. We shall now go forward to success." And so, in a small way, they did. With supply ships which they met in secret rendezvous, they prowled about the Atlantic for 2 months, a floating army of nearly 5,000 men, complete with laundry, cinema, tailor shops, and van. At first, the weather was vile, and the only convoy they met had a battleship escort which prevented them from attacking. They sank a few ships sailing alone, then moved to warmer waters south of the Azores. Here the crew was able to relax a little and enjoy the tropical sunshine. Here too they met a U-boat, the U-124, and exchanged information and messages. Later they found another
submarines.
also protected by a battleship, so again they couldn't attack, and in an odd reversal of roles, guided U-124 and other U-boats onto it.
The morale of the crew during the trips of 2 months in the Atlantic was the whole time excellent. Everybody did his best, and the organization has given every crew member enough rest. The only trouble we had a little bit was the meals and the food must be a little better changed, but that was not a morale for the crew members, but that was a little bit inflexibility of the paymaster.
At a conference in mid-Atlantic, Admiral Lütjens told his captains they were to go north again. And here on March the 15th and 16th, in the convoy dispersal area, they had the biggest success of the voyage. A westbound convoy was sighted, which had just been released by its escorts. At long last, the Tigers had found the lands.
Yo.
One by one, the brave ships were sunk. Athol Foam, British Strength, Silver Fir, Royal Crown. Altogether on the cruise, 22 ships were sunk or captured, 31 men killed, over 600 taken prisoner. Some prisoners were put on board captured tankers and sent with German prize crews to France. Others remained in the warships.
I think because of my age, being only 14 years old, one of the German sailors made friends with me, and he treated me quite well. He gave me cigarettes, chocolates, and he christened me Moses, which is a name which they give to young people aboard the German ship, like a cadet or something like that. The food aboard the German ship was something strange to us. It was sort of out of another world, and it took a lot of getting used to. We got things like fish soup, fruit soup. It wasn't like English food. Other than that, as regards treatment and life aboard the Scharnhorst, I've got no complaints at all.
I can remember one time, the time that we came up onto deck was for the funeral of this donkey greaser. And one was amazed to notice that there was 2 tankers plus the Eisenhower at a standstill while Charlie Hughes, this greaser, was given a full-class military funeral. And this makes one wonder where the Navy was while these ships were at a standstill.
On March the 22nd, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau entered Brest in the northwest of France, having sunk 116,000 tons of Allied shipping.
Sure.
The Germans' most pressing need now was to repair and service the ships in readiness for another cruise, this time with the Bismarck and Prince Eugen. What the British needed was intelligence about them, and one of the first agents they recruited was a French naval lieutenant stationed in Brest dockyard.
All through 1941, I sent reports on German activities, and especially Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. I told the Admiralty where the ships were, which were the camouflage, which were the damage, if they were ready or not to sail. Of course, there was a lot of bombing on these ships, but I'm sorry, bombs very often crashed the town and not very often the ships.
Night after night, there'd be raids from one squadron or another on Brest, and day after day in the papers you'd read that the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had been bombed, and yet the very fact, of course, that there had to be raids night after night meant that they weren't being hit. You had no navigational aids in those days at all, no radar aids. You didn't even have pathfinders. You had to do all the work by pencil and paper. I remember looking down and seeing blackness, nothing but blackness. Some blackness slightly different from the other because it was the sea. But any hope of seeing the docks, even Brest, seemed remote. We flew over it for a bit, dropped our bombs. I hope it hit, well, I remember hoping at the time it hit the land somewhere. When we came back, I remember the pilots of the aircraft wrote down as a result of the operation, doubtful. I remember thinking that was extremely optimistic at the time.
In fact, both ships were damaged by bombs despite elaborate camouflage. So was the cruiser Prince Eugen when she joined them after the sinking of the Bismarck. Soon it became a matter of urgency to get all 3 ships back to Germany intact. Admiral Ciliax worked out a daring plan for the ships to leave Brest by night and go through the Straits of Dover by day. At Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, he and Commodore Ruger, commanding seaward defenses west, put the plan to Hitler.
We were at once let into Hitler's operations room. He arrived there very soon with officers of the Air Force and his own staff. Everybody gave his opinion on his part of the operation. Then Hitler summed up, said, in the case of a man with cancer, we don't do anything, he will die, so we'll operate and go through the channel as suggested. The funny thing was that his summing up was very good, but he took whole sentences exactly as we had said them, which struck me as peculiar.
Admiral Ciliac asked me to come to his cabin and told me there, under this most secrecy, that he has got the order to bring the ships back from Brest to Germany by the channel. I sent for the quartermaster and asked him to bring me the pilot books, sea charts and so on, from Brest to the Atlantic, to South to Africa, and also through the channel, so that he didn't know what was planned and he was confused.
In the Admiralty, we had 2 very strong indications the movement was about to take place. First of all, there was a big increase in the mine-sweeping effort they were putting in. And second, and more important, destroyers were moving down channel to Brest. Obviously, they were going to escort something big, and the only big things there were Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. So it seemed to us quite certain that they were coming out.
I sent several messages and reports to London saying that the ships would sail by night, that the sailing would be probably in the new moon because of the darkness.
We had Philippon's report, which did give his appreciation that it would sail by night. But of course we had a great many other sources of information, and we had to make up our own mind. And our own opinion was that they wouldn't take the risk of going through the channel by day, which would have happened had they sailed from Brest at night.
Well, this was the route for the German ships so carefully prepared by Admiral Ciliax and Commodore Ruger. Northeast from Brest, across to Cherbourg by night, then across the Bay of the Seine in the forenoon, and then hugging the French coast, a midday dash through the Straits of Dover, and so back home. Well, to the British, such a plan seemed too crazy to consider. But to Admiral Ciliax, who had been promised massive sea and air support, there seemed a better chance in fighting off an enemy he could see, rather than one that came at him out of the dark. The night of the breakout was finally chosen, and to preserve complete secrecy, the Germans went in for the most elaborate deceptions. White uniforms and tropical helmets were sent to the ships. Barrels of oil, marked for use in the tropics only, were moved ostentatiously about Brest dockyard. The garrison commander in Paris sent some officers invitations to a shooting party at Rambouillet for the day after the breakout, and in Brest itself preparations went ahead for a fancy dress party. For Admiral Ciliax now, there was nothing more to be done except hope for the best. On the night of February the 11th, 1942, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prince Eugen crept silently to sea. So well had the secret been kept that only Admiral Ciliax and a handful of officers knew where they were bound.
In a very short time, the visibility was excellent, so I could see that the destroyers came along and take over their stations. Gneisenau was following and Prince Eugen too. So the whole unit was together, and the Admiral gave the order to go ahead, so we went up to 17 knots. And then the watch officer asked me, what will be the next course? I answered, northeast. Northeast? Yes. Tomorrow evening we will be at Wilhelmshaven at home. Daybreak came on. The German plane circled around the task force. No British. And then we went further and further, and everybody was expecting and looked around, where are the British, but we couldn't see anything. No plane.
Well, where were the British indeed? That the German ships hadn't been spotted by now was due to an incredible series of accidents, which, if we'd ever really thought they might leave Brest by night, would probably have never happened. The submarine Sea Lion, on patrol off the approaches to Brest, had withdrawn to recharge her batteries and was down here about an hour before the ship sailed. The aircraft which made a nightly reconnaissance of the waters between Brest and Ushant round here had to return because its radar had packed up, and between its departure and the arrival of a relief aircraft, the ships had passed. The reconnaissance aircraft of the next sector between Ushant and the Ile de Bréhat, which is there, also had its radar pack up and returned home, but unaccountably no relief was sent. The aircraft of the third sector between Le Havre and Boulogne there functioned quite normally, but as its patrol finished at dawn, this aircraft had turned for home before the German squadron had arrived. And the German squadron by this time was up here. Well, soon after 10 o'clock, Fighter Command at Biggin Hill were picking up on their radar screen some unusual air activity in the direction of Dieppe, and they sent off a Spitfire to investigate.
I sighted one or two destroyers. I thought initially that the Navy was off course, but I was convinced otherwise shortly afterwards. Heavy anti-aircraft and the fact that these ships were speeding through the water quite fast. Normally we kept radio silence. On this occasion I felt that this was important enough to inform in the clear on the radio and I so broadcast to Biggin Hill what was happening. I then hurried back to base to tell the 11 Group fighter controller what I'd seen. He didn't seem too convinced about it and wanted me to send out another reconnaissance. I was rather annoyed about that.
During the morning, 3, 4, or possibly 5 people who were nearer to the detailed information than I was, nearer to the aircraft or to the radar, came through and spoke to me, and I now realize, being wise after the event, that of course they were trying to explain to me in suitable security words that it was the Neisner and the Scharnhorst, but unfortunately the message just never clicked off anything in my brain because I wasn't thinking of the Neisner and Scharnhorst and had no reason to do so.
And so, inexorably and seemingly invisibly, the German armada sailed on. By 11 they were past the Touquet, by 11:30 they were abeam of Boulogne. And so far not a thing had happened to impede their progress or cause Admiral Ciliac and his men to think that anything would.
The morning went on. We came nearer and nearer to Dover. Then I stepped into the chart house, and then came the chief of staff alongside and asked me, up to now it seems to be only a navigational training trip for you and your crew. When we passed Dover, exactly at noon, we have seen outside on the port side the splashes of some British guns, but very far away from the course of the ship.
Unfortunately, of course, we couldn't see them because there was thick fog the whole time that they were in rain. If we'd been able to see them, it's pretty certain that we should have got hits on them. In fact, I should have got into a lot of trouble if we hadn't.
Now it was the turn of the motor torpedo boats at Dover, which had just returned to harbour from a morning exercise.
The Chief of Staff rang up to say the battle cruisers were off Boulogne. How soon could we go? Well, we were, of course, warmed up and ready, so we went immediately.
Because I wouldn't have normally have seen anything being down below on the radio, but the radio packed up. I shouted up the voice pipe. Couldn't get any sense up there. It was just all shouting and hollering and panic stations. And so I went up top. Wow. And I thought the whole German Navy was after me. Just me alone, you know, battleships, destroyers, minesweepers, E-boats 20, 30 yards away, sky black with Messerschmitts. Told the skipper that the radio had packed up, so he said, grab a gun. Anyway, I got hold of a rifle, pointed at the Scharnhorst, just to try and look brave.
No, it wasn't a reasonable operation from our point of view. Motor torpedo boats are strictly night animals, and to try and attack through a screen of E-boats in daylight, E-boats being both faster and much more heavily armed, it wasn't really an act of war. We did, I think, the only thing to do, which was to close the E-boats to about 400 yards and fire our torpedoes under them. Battle cruisers simply turned towards to avoid the torpedoes, and that was that.
Next came a suicide mission from Manston. 6 ancient swordfish, led by Eugene Esmond, whose squadron the year before had put a torpedo into the Bismarck. Like the MTVs, they'd been expecting to make a night attack. They'd also been promised an escort of fighters, most of which never turned up.
We circled Manston for a few minutes, waiting for our fighter escort to turn up. As soon as the first squadron arrived, Esmond decided it was time to go, and we went down towards the sea, leveling off at 50 feet.
We recognized them as very old swordfish. The torpedo planes, they came nearer and nearer and a very low height and were attacked by the E-boats and the German fighters. One after the other was shot down, and then everybody on the bridge thought, oh, these poor guys, just suicide.
Of the 18 men who had set out from Manston minutes before, only 5 survived. They were all decorated for bravery. Lieutenant Commander Esmond was given a posthumous Victoria Cross.
In the early afternoon, we have passed the Dover Strait, and from then on we were very happy that the worst part of the mission had been safely completed. Then we had only to go through the sands to the Dutch coast, but suddenly the ship was lifted due to an explosion under the forepart of the ship by a mine, ground mine. From this moment on, we didn't have any electricity, no steam, nothing. The ship was completely dead. And that was a very critical phase. If some British bombers have attacked during that time, but there were no British. So we were very glad that we could steam away in about 30 minutes by 27 knots with 3 engines.
When I estimated that the ships had passed my area, I ordered a bottle of champagne for the operations room. Soon after, we got a message that Scharnhorst had hit a mine. That gave us quite a shock, but I took the message and looked at it very closely and found that the mine detonation had happened 2 miles inside the area of neighboring Edinburgh, and so I ordered another bottle of champagne.
But there was no champagne for the British. The Gneisenau and Prince Eugen were now off the coast of Holland, up here, somewhere ahead of Scharnhorst, and here they were attacked by a group of destroyers which came out from Harwich. None of the torpedoes from the destroyers hit, and one of them, the Worcester, was very seriously damaged. For the rest of the afternoon, both ships and Scharnhorst, now some 30 miles astern, were attacked by groups of bombers which came out from bases in eastern England. 242 altogether were sent out. Only about 39 found the target, and of these, 15 were shot down. They scored no hits, and it seemed now that there was nothing more that we could do. However, other bombers had previously laid mines ahead of the tracks of the 2 ships, and at 8 o'clock off Terschelling here, Gneisenau hit one of these mines, while an hour and a half later, Scharnhorst hit another. Despite considerable damage to both ships, they safely reached harbour in the early hours of the next morning.
At noon the next day, we entered the lock at Wilhelmshaven, and we were naturally glad that we have completed this mission. And suddenly, I have seen on the quays of the lock a lot of people. And I told to the Captain, I think there is now a big reception committee. I think we have done an excellent job.
Of course, it was a failure. I think probably the main reason was because we had planned very confidently on the fact that they would go through the channel by night. And of course, coming through the channel by day put all our plans out.
So ended an operation which Admiral Ciliac said had succeeded beyond all expectations. The London Times agreed. Nothing more mortifying to the pride of British sea power, it said, has happened in home waters since the 17th century. And yet what had been tactically a German triumph was also strategically a German failure. For by leaving Brest, the German surface navy had abandoned its Atlantic base. For Captain Hoffman, too, the conclusion of the operation marked an end and a beginning.
And Großadmiral Raeder came in Kiel on board to present me with the Ritterkreuz. He told me that I would be promoted to Admiral and would have to leave the ship. I asked him if I could refuse the promotion and remain on the ship. But of course, that was not allowed.
During the next 2 weeks, there were heavy air raids on both ships in a final effort to destroy them. But on February the 26th, Gneisenau was so badly damaged that she took no further part in the war. The lucky Scharnhorst escaped again, though her repairs were not completed before the summer, and she wasn't fully operational before the end of the year. Well, Hitler was now obsessed by an idea that the British had plans to invade Norway, and he gave orders for what remained of the German surface fleet to be concentrated there for its defense. Accordingly, in March 1943, Scharnhorst sailed to join Tirpitz and other ships in the fjords of northern Norway. This bleak anchorage was to be the Scharnhorst's home for the next 9 months, the last 9 months of her life. Her crew longed to take her to sea, but the timid policy of the German Admiralty and an increasing shortage of oil fuel condemned her to a life of immobility. It was the sort of life, like that of the British sailors at Scapa Flow, where one had to make one's own amusements.
We were 4 hours on, 4 hours off. We had to make our own games, playing chess, cards. We had boxing down below. On our time off, we went ashore, had snow fights. We had the men dressed up like women in a cabaret, and we'd see the cinema. We had fish in the morning, fish at lunch, fish at night. For supper, I had fish poisoning in the end. We were always ready, because the morale was very high, to have a go out at sea.
And then at the end of 1943, the chance came. With the approach of the Arctic winter and its almost perpetual night, the British had restarted their convoys to Russia. There were demands on the German Admiralty to help relieve the pressure on the Eastern Front, and Scharnhorst was ordered to attack the next eastbound convoy. Rear Admiral Bai, a former Commodore of destroyers, veteran of Narvik and the Channel Dash, was appointed to direct the operation. Under him was Scharnhorst's new captain, Fritz Hintzer, who had joined the ship 2 months before. Christmas Day dinner on the mess decks was barely over when the sailing orders came. With an escort of destroyers, Scharnhorst made her way down the long fjord to the open sea. Late that night, Admiral Bai foolishly broke radio silence to signal to his base, and this was immediately picked up by the British Admiralty. Within minutes, the news had been passed to the battleship Duke of York, which, under Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, and quite unknown to the Scharnhorst, was approaching the convoy from the west.
I think 4 o'clock in the morning on Boxing Day, I was woken up by a signal from the Admiralty saying the Admiralty believe the Scharnhorst is at sea. And that's the only communication I had with the Admiralty during the whole of the time I was up there.
Well, all that night, Scharnhorst and her destroyers steamed northeast towards the convoy. It was blowing a gale from the southwest, and the destroyers were rolling heavily in a following sea. At 8:20, Scharnhorst was here, steaming north, but without the destroyers, who'd gone off to the south and never regained contact with her. Now, 2 things Admiral Bai didn't realize. First, that the convoy he was looking for was some 30 miles to the west of him, and secondly, that a covering force of 3 cruisers was fast approaching from the east. At 8:40, the cruisers picked up Scharnhorst on their radar at 17 miles, and when the range was down to 6 miles, they fired star shell and opened fire. Well, Scharnhorst was completely taken by surprise, put her wheel hard over, and sped away as fast as she could to the east. 1 shell had hit her, and though it didn't kill anybody, its effect on the outcome of that day was to be decisive, for it had completely destroyed her forward radar set. From now on, Scharnhorst was blind. The cruisers didn't attempt to follow her because their speed was at least 5 knots less than Scharnhorst, and in any case, their main duty was to fall back on the convoy in case the enemy attacked again. And that's just what she did do. Soon after noon, Scharnhorst was sighted with the cruisers again, and there was another brief engagement. Norfolk was hard hit, Sheffield was hit too, but less so, and if Admiral Bai had pressed home his attack, things might have gone badly for us. But this was the second time he'd been surprised without warning, and not wishing to risk his ship further, he broke off the engagement and turned for home. Now, the coast of Norway was only about 100 miles away, as you can see, and the Scharnhorst going at 28 knots. Her crew, or those of them who weren't being acutely seasick, many of them hadn't been to sea before, reckoned that they would be back snugly at anchor in the fjord within a matter of hours. They knew that the cruisers were following them, but it never occurred to anyone, not even Admiral Bai, that any danger lay ahead. Because the forward radar was out of action, they didn't know that the Duke of York, here with the cruiser Jamaica and 4 destroyers, had now cut them off from their base, and that Admiral Fraser's plans were about to come to fruition. For the 3rd and last time that day, Scharnhorst was in for a shock.
On the bridge of the Duke of York, from the reports from the Sheffield and the Belfast, we could judge almost exactly when we were going to make contact with the Scharnhorst. And we knew we had about an hour of awkward waiting before action was joined. And this was really the time when the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Fraser, was simply dominating the whole ship. He wore no naval uniform as such. He just wore old trousers and a polo-neck shirt, polo-neck sweater, and a rather battered admiral's hat. And with his pipe belching sparks and flame, he moved among us all, being extremely confident and quiet and delightful. And I particularly remember we had two young midshipmen, only about teenagers, who had both been to sea for a very few weeks and were very frightened, as we all were. And it was wonderful the way Admiral Fraser, realizing how these two lads were pretty nervous, found time and the humanity to give them all little nameless, useless tasks to do, to keep them busy. And at the same time realizing we knew how he felt, winking slightly to us to realize that we also were nervous. It was a real triumph of a single personality dominating a ship's company.
When we decided exactly the time the battle would start, as we were following the ship right down, it came out to about 5:30, I think, and so we discussed whether we should have tea before the battle or wait till afterwards. We had tea before the battle.
There had been a broadcast on the public address system to the ship's company, which told them exactly what the tactics were going to be, and the idea was to close to within 12,000 yards, 6 miles of the Scharnhorst, before firing Star Shell, in the hope that the first broadside would take her by surprise and prove lethal. So we watched her on the plot, coming down from the northward, on a closing course, until a moment came and the signal went out at 12,000 yards, illuminate the target with Star Shell. I was fortunate enough to be on the bridge a few seconds after this, and the Star Shell burst right over the target, and it was the most incredible sight. The Scharnhorst looking like a marvelous fish, like a huge salmon coming almost dead towards us. And as she became aware of the Star Shell bursting above her and sensing something to the southward, she swung her wheel right over to port, and we had this wonderful sight of this very graceful, beautiful ship, with all her guns turning round now towards the starboard to engage this unknown unit, this menace to the south of her. And then, as our first broadside thundered out, we watched our first broadside fall right across her stern.
A star shot came right across us. We were lit up from stern onwards, and they landed on the deck, and I was in the tower then, when I was certain the armament had a hit, and the armor plate was absolutely wrecked, and something whistling around in the middle of it, like it's coming through, and I grabbed to my, I thought, oh, here it comes, but it didn't come through, it went outside, and there was haywire all over.
One shell hit Scharnhorst's boiler room, and though the damage was patched up, its effects were felt later. Meanwhile, she took advantage of her superior speed.
By now we could see in the plot that the Scharnhorst was drawing away from us so fast that very soon she was going to be out of radar range. We couldn't see her by now. We were firing entirely by radar. And eventually the moment came when the Admiral ordered to cease fire. And immediately you could feel in the bridge the effect of this order. We felt we've had our chance. It'll never come again. She'll slip away now towards the northeast in the darkness and the winter conditions. And the only hope at this time was the destroyers.
I realized at once in the destroyers that we were going to be faced with a chase. We only had a little speed in excess of the Scharnhorst, and to catch up was going to be quite a business. After a time, I had a shout from the officer in the plot who said he was sure we were getting much nearer the Scharnhorst, followed almost immediately by another shout, and he said he thought she had altered course. I could now see the Scharnhorst in my glasses and realized that this in fact had happened, that she had turned round and was steering between the two groups of destroyers, so giving us the most perfect target.
The destroyers hit her with at least 3 torpedoes, and from this moment her end was certain.
The destroyers were sending, or they came towards us with torpedoes, but we fought them off. We took another course again,
again thinking to go to the Norwegian coast. But then the artillery started up again. And by that time, the cruisers were there as well. So we had them from both sides. They were behind us, in front of us, on the side of us. And they came all from all sides.
When we got up to her, I think within about half a mile, she was half over on the side, no, a quarter over, I'd say, and she was fires all over the place, and it was really very unpleasant having to go on shooting at her, because we didn't know whether she'd surrendered or what she'd done, but we had to think her, unpleasant as it was.
By 7:45, we were alight from stern right over the ship. And we had these last torpedo hits on starboard side, and it came abundant ship. With that, I went up to the tower, into the crow's nest to get out. And by the time I get out there, the ship already was starboard side lying, so we had to have a hand shaking us to pull us out. And there was the artillery captain up top, and he pushed his hands out to us, and we made a chain to pull each other out. And as I get out, I see the blokes jumping right from the searchlight tower right down onto the ship. By the time they hit the water, they were already instantly killed because they hit the iron right beneath the water. I went over to the starboard side, and by the time I got over to the starboard side, she just went flop right over, and I was slung right out into the water, away from the ship. And the first thing I thought about was raft. I've got no life jacket. Well, I haven't had time to get one. And I saw all bits floating around, and the next thing I saw, there was a piece of wood, and I just grabbed for it, and it was one of the gunnery rafts from the bonbons.
Yeah, well, after seeing her on fire and exploding everywhere, a lot of us that was stood around more or less just watching her go down, seeing these chaps jump forward, thinking, well, they've had their lot, and thought to ourselves, well, it could have been us instead of them. It's not a nice death to go through, you know. But I thought, well, it was either them or us.
By the time I was lying pretty on the raft, I had somebody got hold of my boot, which I let go. Because if you don't let a boot go, you go with them. And because you couldn't save anybody, because the moment you're in the water, all you think about is yourselves.
And then, as we watched the scan, you could see the echo that had been the Scharnhorst gradually getting smaller and smaller, little golden streak. And as we watched it going smaller, it eventually just disappeared. And we knew that the Scharnhorst had sunk.
I saw all the blokes screaming and shouting, Scharnhorst, hip hip hooray, hip hip hooray. And then of a sudden the song was coming up on a grave, Siemens grave. There's nothing but no roses. By that time I looked round, I saw the ship turn right round, and I saw the propellers still turning, because by that time the English had shot a star shot right across us. Then all of a sudden I saw her going down, come back up again. Then all of a sudden finally she went down. As she went down, I heard this tremendous tremble in my stomach, in my legs, you know. There was a big explosion below. And by that time all I thought about was to get away, get safe. You know, when I looked round, I see these blokes there swimming between all these bits and still shouting Heil our Führer, you know, and Scharnhorst, hip hip hooray, again and again. I thought, well, what a waste.
From Scharnhorst's crew of 1,968, only 36 survived.
Oh.
It was the last duel between battleships fought by the Royal Navy.
So that was the life and death of the Scharnhorst. I really enjoyed it, and it was very, very interesting. I always thought that the German battleship Bismarck was the most successful, but nobody's perfect. This proved me wrong. It is so unnecessary to go to war. I mean, those innocent lives lost just performing your duty. Seriously. Nobody should be at war. I wish the world could be at peace. Yeah. But then again, it is what it is. That being said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel, my social media. What I have to offer you at my Patreon are cartoons, movies and TV shows. If you want me to react to any other videos, music, etc., please leave a comment down below. You know where to reach me. And a word of wisdom for today. Watch as many documentaries as you possibly can, because the more you learn about history, everyday life, or any type of subject, the more knowledge you gain. Have a blessed day further, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.